G'day guys, welcome back to True Footy. The season to me is more or less over now. Once the draft is over, we're into the true part of the off season, and in today's video we're just going to discuss what happened at the 2024 draft, which wrapped up earlier today with day 2. Had 2 really good streams, 3 hours in length. I'm exhausted, and today we're just going to give a little rundown on what happened on day 2, but in particular I want to go through each individual club and give my thoughts on how they went, at least in my opinion, at this year's draft. First of all, I did hit my goal of hitting 33,000 subscribers. I wanted it by day 1 of the draft, but we hit it during the second live stream, so I just wanted to say thanks to everyone who's shown the faith and hit subscribe on this channel. I really appreciate it. All right, so we won't go through absolutely pick by pick, but a little bit of a rundown on how today went. Interestingly, Thomas Sims, the first pick of the day, was a surprise. Richmond adding a third key forward. I'll give my thoughts on individual strategies soon, but that was a bit of a surprise, and it was just interesting broadly to see the ranking of key forwards seemed almost flipped on how it actually played out. We saw a number of them go. Jobe Shanahan went next. Then there was Jack Whitlock here. I think few would have predicted, at least in the media, that Jonty Ford would be the first key forward taken, but ahead of Armstrong, and the Jack Whitlock would be the 5th, I think, taken, given there's Thomas Sims there and Jobe Shanahan. So a very interesting way that played out. Hawthorn entered the draft with Noel Miraz. Again, a little bit of a surprise, although perhaps that was lined up for Jack Whitlock. Again, we'll go into teams specifically here. There was a little bit of a trend here. I mean, teams started to trade. I think Brisbane banked 3 future thirds or something like that because they had a number of picks they weren't going to use, but they did get their academy player there. The Camprioli boys both joined Carlton. Joel Cochran here. There was another trend. I think there was 3 players bid on that were NGAs that their club did not match, and that included Joel Cochran, a bit of a surprise getting to Collingwood. I thought Sydney would go there. Cooper Bell was a GWS Giants academy player, joins the Gold Coast Suns. And we also had Riak Andrew as well, who's not listed as an academy player, but as far as I'm aware, was part of Melbourne's academy. Either way, he's joined the Sydney Swans, so a little bit of an interesting trend there. We saw St Kilda trade back in. We saw the number 1 ruck in this year's draft, Dodson, go at 53. That was a big surprise, really. And considering Geelong as well was rumoured to go for Alex Dodson over the last couple of days, we were hearing that rumour. They took a different ruckman instead of Dodson. Just goes to show you can't believe everything you hear. A couple of father sons, Tyler Welsh, Jaron Carr, and River Stevens towards the end there. Rounded out an interesting day where we had 71 total selections. So let's go into the club by club stuff. So we'll go through alphabetically, which means we'll start with the Crows. And I'll just say that the Crows, the Brisbane Lions, and Carlton all went fairly predictably in the sense that we know pick 4 was what Adelaide were going to take. That obviously happened on the first day. Nonetheless, a great selection in my opinion. It's pretty hard to split the top group of midfielders there. I don't know. I honestly think I might have taken Sid Draper second if it was my own personal opinion, which is only worth so much. But long story short, Adelaide got a great young midfielder there who I think could prove to be one of the best players from this draft long term. And then Tyler Welsh was, as expected, that was telegraphed. We knew that they were going to take him with their second selection, so he wasn't bid on at all. I've noticed as well he's grown a little bit to 192 centimetres, so he's a bit of an undersized key forward at 192. It's nice to see he's grown a little bit. That will help him at AFL level. Perhaps he'll continue to grow, and perhaps he's more of a third tall forward going forward. But either way, Adelaide bow out, with this pretty much going exactly as we anticipated. Let's talk about the Brisbane Lions. Similarly, I think this was probably predicted to some extent. Levi Ashcroft and Sam Marshall, they'll walk away with 2 outstanding prospects who, despite going 5 and 25, you do wonder if these guys went open pool. I would make an argument that both of them would have gone higher. Ashcroft might have gone pick 1 or 2, and Sam might have gone in the teens or something like that. So an outstanding result for a team that won the premiership this year. And then they matched their own academy player. We thought going into the day they would possibly draft a key position player. Well, they've matched their academy bid for, I think he's a key forward from memory. I won't pretend to have a good intimate knowledge of him. From memory, they took Luke Lloyd and, of course, Logan Morris. But I think Ty might be taller than both of those players off the top of my head. So we'll add something different there. And yeah, a bit of a no-brainer, that one. Carlton's day went absolutely to plan. We know they took Jagger Smith yesterday. Again, a great selection there. You can't really go wrong. Traded it up somewhat aggressively to get him when you consider the total cost was 12, 14 OEs and a future second, which is now at Hawthorn. They were ambitious trying to get this pick, and to be honest, he seems like a real safe bet gun midfielder there. I did think maybe Draper, but that was just personal opinion. But Jagger Smith, I feel like he could absolutely play a role as early as next year, despite his small frame. But I think, he's proven he can play at VFL and win plenty of the footy. So I think he'll have no trouble adjusting to the level. Harry O'Farrell, this was another one that we sort of saw coming. There is a family connection there to his father, who I think is their lawyer. The concern or the question mark, I think, for Carlton going into today was whether a bid for either of these boys would come before pick 38 or 40 as it ended up being. But obviously that would have absorbed the pick. They get their extra pick. They get their target at a key position defender there. And some real good balance to here. You got a couple of wingmen here for really good value out of South Australia. I don't imagine retention is going to be an issue with those South Australian boys. And Harry O'Farrell as a key defender who slid down the rankings a little bit this year. He was rated much higher earlier in the year. For whatever reason has slid. But there's a lot of competition for talls in this year's draft. That was a huge feature of today's activity in particular. So Carlton overall would have to be stoked with how this played out. Collingwood similarly, we couldn't really have predicted how this day would have gone for them. 3 late-ish selections. I think they traded one to the future that they couldn't use as well from memory. But either way, the big surprise was Joel Cochrane. Came first in the time trial as well. Great athlete. I think a junior athlete in terms of long distance running, 195 centimeters. We knew going into today that the Pies would probably going to look at talls. I said the same thing last year. Good opportunity to add some young talls to the list. They didn't do that last year. They've done that this year. And Cochrane, I'm a little surprised Sydney let that go. I thought they might have a need for a key position defender. But I think Collingwood will be happy with that. Charlie West as well, 194 centimetre key forward. So they've got their bookends there, and that allowed them the freedom to use their third pick on simply the best available talent from Will Hayes. And a little bit of an underrated player. I've heard a lot about Will Hayes, perhaps because I'm from Western Australia. He's described as a wingman or small forward with pace. Skinny sort of fella, but he's going to have time to develop, I'd imagine, in a team that is probably going to be in the window for the next few years, I would have thought. And now we have Essendon. They had the guaranteed pick of Isaac Kako on the first nights. I made the comments as well that I thought maybe trading out pick 9 in hindsight, given that the bid came after pick 9, was pointless. There was a suggestion that if St Kilda might have bid on him if Essendon had the pick just to be difficult, and I'll never know if that was true or not. But either way, they still hold 2 first next year, which is a good position to hold. I believe on the Fox Footy coverage, they were saying that Essendon tried to trade their future first or one of their future firsts to West Coast for pick 30 to secure Job Shanahan, and it shows what West Coast thought of Job Shanahan because they rejected that deal and they missed out on him. However, Essendon still maintain their 2 picks and they get Kale Gerine, a 200 centimetre ruck forward. Pretty strong marking and powerful sort of player. Angus Clark is a good selection here too. I've seen Dylan Alexander compare him to perhaps a cheaper Toba Travalia. He's listed here as a key defender. I don't think that is the way he's going to settle at AFL level, particularly when you consider he's 189 centimetres. Reece Unwin, Zach Johnson, I did think these guys might go a little bit earlier. That was kind of the trend of day 2 of the draft. Lots of sliders, not massive sliders, but good value selections here for guys like Unwin and Johnson, who are both listed as midfielders. Fremantle had an interesting draft. I wouldn't have predicted they'd draft Murphy Reid, and I do suspect, based on what's reported, when it got to West Coast, Port Adelaide, and then Fremantle selections, the 3 players that were always going to be distributed amongst those 3 clubs were probably Joe Berry, Bo Allen, and Murphy Reid. It just came down to which order. So I think Fremantle did have intentions to trade with West Coast and get Joe Berry ahead of Port Adelaide. I don't think it was for Bo Allen. I'll never know for sure, but the suggestion is that it's Joe Berry that they were chasing. Nonetheless, they settled for Murphy Reid, who, to be fair, is a very talented player. Maybe doesn't fit the same degree of need for Fremantle as that high half forward that Joe Berry is, like pushing back and adding defensive pressure. However, Murphy has skills as well that Joe Berry doesn't have. Whether he starts his career on a wing or at half forward, I'm not too sure. He's shown he's dangerous around goals. He's a quality player. I could also see him playing that running and distributing role off half back. So I'm intrigued to see what Fremantle do with Murphy Reid positionally. I think he's good enough to play early. Fremantle do have a fairly well-developed team that's starting to enter that finals and premiership window period, but I think he's good enough to contribute as early as next year. Charlie Nichols was a surprise in the sense that we saw a number of teams who I didn't think were going to take tools around that part of the draft. Key forward, can play key back. I think Fremantle are fairly well stocked at both ends of the ground. They took Ollie Murphy last year, and I think there's a bit of a logjam there. But as a key forward, maybe it's a long-term sort of depth option to, Amos and Tracy and Jackson, who I imagine the three that they roll with in a best 22 sense. But Charlie Nichols is a good prospect, and they've just decided to go best available there, presumably. Jaron Carr, it's nice to see rewarded. I have met Jaron once, a little bit older. I think he must be 20. By that, a little bit of an undersized key forward. Don't know a whole heap about him, but I know he's working very hard and he's done a lot to earn this opportunity, so well done to him. Then we've got the Cats, and I must admit, I don't know a lot about these players, but this is the thing about Geelong. This is where they do their best work, with their late selections that you don't see coming. Look at Lawson Humphries as recently as last season. So they've added Jay Polkinghorne, Jacob Mollier. I will say this one was a bit of a surprise, not only because he's a ruck, and I commented pre-draft, I didn't see why Geelong were in the market for a ruck, having taken Toby Conway and Mitch Edwards in previous seasons. I suppose they need, more with Reece Stanley potentially gone in a year, but maybe a mature one, I would have thought. Anyway, doesn't matter. The interesting part was actually that they did not take Alex Dodson despite him being available there. So they added St Kilda's NGA in Lennox Hoffman, who's listed as a KPD, but I think might be more of a medium defender at the next level. And then Caton Matafai Forbes went at pick 69, one of the best names in the draft, at the best number in the draft. Again, I'm not going to lie, I don't know a whole heap about him, but Geelong have a proven history of striking gold at this part of the draft. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see a rising star contender next year. Gold Coast didn't do a lot of work. A lot of it was just about securing Lombard and presumably taking one more pick. They took GWS Academy prospect Cooper Bell as a 199cm key defender. Like I said, a lot of talls around this range of the draft. He's got a late birthday, I noticed. That's as much as I know about him as a GWS Giants Academy prospect. So not a whole lot to say here, other than the fact that Leo Lombard, is a good quality small midfielder, really competitive, played in the VFL Premiership when he was like 16, if I'm not mistaken. So has the capacity to play next year. Whether or not Gold Coast need him next year, there's a bit of talent there now. A bit of depth, a bit of maturity. It might be a little bit difficult. There's Jake Rogers, and a not dissimilar player taken the year before. So they're in a good position talent-wise. We already knew that. GWS had an interesting draft, generally speaking. So I think a lot of the interesting stuff or surprising stuff was done on day one. Well, maybe not surprising. We know that they tend to be unpredictable with their drafting, and that has played out again with this year's draft. So Hannaford, I do think, is an outstanding selection. I've been a big fan of him. Harrison Oliver, a little bit earlier than I expected at 181 centimeters, small defender. That's quite early for a player of that type. However, he is a good quality of player, and the Giants have the order, and they'll back that in. Cody Angove is the biggest bolter, I would have thought, in this year's draft. Not an absolute certainty to get drafted at all, but very draftable talent, and they've reached for him at 24. Again, another sub 6 foot forward half player for the Giants here. So they're really doubling down on this strategy of fleet-footed forward line. When you consider Phoenix Goddard, Darcy Jones, recent selections, Toby Green, Toby Bedford, Brent Daniels, clear strategy. It's interesting to see how hard they're committing to that. As for today, they added Jack O, I believe it's pronounced, or Ow. Actually, I think it was pronounced Ow on the presentation, actually. But a very big midfielder, up there with Josh Smiley in terms of size. Not as inside dominant as Josh Smiley, but a little bit more of an accumulator, classy player. Either way, I did think they needed a midfielder, so this makes perfect sense from Greater Western Victoria. And Logan Smith was the All-Australian ruckman this year, so match a bid for him at 71. I think they matched it, or I think they might have taken that themselves. A very strong ruck prospect. The third selected in this year's draft. So again, going back to Geelong, it was interesting that Geelong were linked to both Logan Smith and Alex Dodson, and they took a different ruck altogether. Hawthorn had a pretty quiet draft. It was a pretty busy trade period, obviously adding Battle and Barras, but they decided they weren't done with the tall defenders, adding Noah Mraz. Now on talent, I think this is good. I wasn't sure how much he was going to slide because he did a foot injury, a navicular, I think it is. But he was a highly rated talent this whole year, so 35 on value for the talent is good, I think. I thought about it, do they need a key back? They've just offloaded a couple, they've just traded in a couple. But then when you consider the fact that, by the time Tom Barras is 33, Noah Mraz will be 22 and probably ready for AFL level. So, from a needs point of view, I don't have too big of concerns. There was also a number of talls that just went bang, bang, bang before Hawthorn's selection, including Jack Whitlock, who might have been the preferred. I'm not too sure exactly. Then they added Cody Anderson, who, again, I think has slid down the order a little bit. I remember considering his name in earlier mock drafts this year as a medium-sized midfielder. So, again, just best best available, I presume, at that range. Not a whole lot to see here, but I do know that Noel Moraes is a very talented young key defensive prospect, so I think they'll back themselves in to get his foot right, and long term they'll be happy. Melbourne, we knew we were just going to take the 3 selections after, double dipping in the first round for the second year in a row. Harvey Langford and Xavier Lindsay, look, they weren't the expected picks that most had for Melbourne, I think, up until Kaltumi's late mail. I thought Bo Allen, Alex Toru, Josh Smiley, some of the other types around here. They ended up with Langford, who was the best available midfielder. Tall, strong marking player who can rest forward and impact the scoreboard there. Very classy player too, very intentional with his kicking. Not the quickest athlete, but that's offset by is a very dangerous midfielder in Xavier Lindsay, who does have good two-way running, who does have good speed, good outside game. And, when you consider those guys add to Caleb Windsor, 3 distinctly different but very talented players, all drafted at either pick 6 or pick 11 over the last couple of years. So I think Melbourne will be very happy with this little midfield rejuvenation that's happening. And by the time some of these guys move on, and there's a lot of conjecture around the futures for Petrarca and Oliver and all that, generally speaking, they're going to be fairly well placed in that sense. They don't hold a first rounder next season, but they might do that thing where they trade 2026 into 2025. They've done that before. Aiden Johnson, I'm not going to lie, I don't know really much about it at all. I feel like I've heard the name, and you can see that the AFL website doesn't even have a profile for him. He's a mature ager, if that is correct. That means he's 24, turning 25 next season, 193 centimetres, and I think he was listed as a forward, so a speculative one. I think these two are the main ones, and I've always said that Xavier Lindsay he was my preference for West Coast if he got through that far, and one of my favourite players from the draft, so I think the D's have done well here. North Melbourne with a subject of probably the most conversation alongside Richmond in this year's draft for a trade they did, which we discussed a little bit yesterday, but we can rehash it. Finn O'Sullivan at pick 2, look, on talent, they'll be happy with that. There was a lot of suggestion that they might trade the pick for Taru, and or just take him outright. In the end, they've gone with the best available midfielder. I think he's got some versatility where he can, start his career off halfback. Could he play as a medium-sized forward? I probably like him off halfback more personally. But there is a real logjam of midfielders there at North Melbourne. That being said, he's probably going to be a gun, so I'm not too concerned about that pick for North Melbourne. Maybe in an ideal world, if they'd gotten a decent trade to trade down and get Taru and another player, I don't think they'd have eventuated for North Melbourne, so they decided not to sacrifice too much on talent and took Finn O'Sullivan. So obviously the big trade is the future first for Matt Whitlock and a future second going back to North Melbourne from Richmond, which you can probably quantify as being about pick 27 in next year's draft, given that was the same pick that Richmond traded to them this year. So 2 27s for a potential top 5 pick. Now, I can see a lot of North fans justifying it. It's a tough one. I think the reality is, and this is also true of my club, that trading this year was obscenely difficult. And at least North Melbourne probably can place a lower premium on their first rounder next year, given they've had so much access to top-end talent. So from that position, it's kind of justifiable to get a key forward in Matt Whitlock. I presume they've drafted him as a key forward. He played down back as well. 197 centimetres, I think, is shortchanging him a little. I think he's taller than that. I think he's about 199. But look, they obviously rate the kid. The thing is, if you do enough mental gymnastics about this, you could say that had they not traded 25 for Caleb Daniel, they would have just taken Matt Whitlock. So in essence, they've traded a future first for Caleb Daniel. Anyway, look, it was obscenely expensive. I accept that they've got their man, and I also accept that North Melbourne tried to offer that deal to so many clubs. In fact, I think every club from pick 8 onwards in this year's draft, and no one would accept it. And that reflects what the market was doing in this year's draft. So I'm not sure I'm going to say I like it, but maybe the trade isn't as absolutely nuts as it appeared to be in real time. We'll see. And if Matt Whitlock is a gun, then North Melbourne won't care. They also added Luke Urquhart, a decent inside midfielder, good contested game, good athlete, not the best kick from memory, but generally speaking, best available midfielder, at least in their eyes, obviously. And I think the second Urquhart to play for North Melbourne, was it Gavin Urquhart? I'm not sure. River Stevens, son of Anthony, also joined a small forward. Don't know a whole heap about him, but there's a few father sons from a great era now at North Melbourne. There's Anthony Stevens, there's Jackson Archer, and there's Cooper Harvey, I think, is still there. I don't think he got delisted, but yeah, nice little bit of romance. Now we've got Port Adelaide taking 3 Victorian players and 3 players that we or at least 2 that we expected to go earlier. Joe Berry's probably about right in terms of value. Obviously traded up gave up a pick in the 40s to secure him. And look, I think that suits them, and I think he's a good quality player. So I think Port Adelaide will be happy with that, and they had to, outbid Fremantle for this pick. I think it does make sense. There was some suggestion that they'd go Harry Armstrong with that pick, and I think they've made the right call not going the tall player, especially when you consider at their second selection, Jack Whitlock made it. I don't think too many people would have thought Jack Whitlock would be available at Port Adelaide's second selection. And equally, Christian Moraes is a little bit of a slider there as a hard-working wingman who hits the scoreboard as well. Ball use can be a little bit off, but generally speaking, a good, aggressive player who works really hard. And I think those two players in particular are good value selections. And I think both Berry and Moraes, with their outside game and their athleticism, their ability to get up in the ground and work hard, suggests to me, I reckon those guys could at least offer something earlier than expected, and perhaps next year could play games. Certainly Joe Berry, in my opinion. Jack Whitlock will be a slow burn. The thing about him as a key forward, I wasn't convinced they needed one, but maybe at their first pick, that would have been a bad pick. But at their second pick, to add a 200cm key forward, that is stylistically different to what they've already got. They've got a lot of hybrid or slightly undersized key forwards. He had something different and is a talented player. So generally speaking, I think Port Adelaide should be fairly happy with that crop of players. Good balance, good value, good quality. Richmond, again, one of the most talked about teams, well, probably the most talked about teams. I don't think I've seen a team have a draft haul like this outside the expansion clubs. So we talked about Lawler, Smiley, Houghton, and Fall. Lawler was a no-brainer, as was probably Smiley at that pick, so they've bolstered their midfield. Taj Houghton was a bit of a surprise, maybe a bit of a smokescreen, all this talk about Bo Allen. In the end, they've added 8 Victorian players. They didn't stray interstate once, but with all the quality of Victorian talent in this draft, makes sense, to stay local to some extent. I think Taj Houghton, this will be a long-term play naturally. He's going to be probably recovering from that ACL for the first half of next year, but in terms of sheer talent and the fact that he's quite different, has more of an outside leaning, crafty, marking forward as well when he goes forward. I think he's definitely different to those players. I think they've balanced that out really nicely. Jonty Fall was the big surprise. I won't criticize it because, I'm not as sharp a talent scout as some of these guys making the decisions, but generally speaking, Jonty Fall wasn't expected to be, certainly not the first key forward taken, and we weren't sure if pick 14 was going to be the pick Richmond used on a key forward. It was. They've added Jonty Fall. They added Luke Traynor as well later, which we already discussed, and Harry Armstrong, so I thought this might be all the talls that Richmond selected. They pulled a surprise on day 2 by getting Thomas Sims, who, again, probably, I don't think was the next highest rated key forward based on consensus rankings, right? But it was an even talent pool. And again, not to criticize who they took, other than the fact that I didn't expect a third key forward to fall at this pick. I was sitting there as an Eagles fan saying, please don't take Jobe. No, they shouldn't, because they don't need a key forward. Boom, Thomas Sims. I do think, having a look at Richmond's list before this draft, I did think they do need some key forwards, but I still would have thought it would cap out at 2 key forwards in this year's draft. They've added 3, but if you're going to draft talls, do it in a draft which is strong with talls, which this was, and do it early. And this is the first year of Richmond's rebuild, really, the first time they've had access, so they've loaded up on talls. Didn't get a true key back, but I think Luke Traynor, for the player that he is as an intercepting defender, could probably play next year. I think that's good. And Jasper Alger was expected to go, well, I think one of the mocks I saw him going in one of Richmond's 8 selections when that still belonged, at 24 or whatever. So as far as value goes, geez, they'll be very happy with that. Not to mention, they banked a future first next year tied to North Melbourne. They won't hold a second rounder, I don't think, at this stage, but they hold both North Melbourne and Richmond first rounders, which this year was picks 1 and 2. So I think Richmond should be happy. It's hard to, have that many picks in this year's draft plus next year and not be happy. But I'm intrigued, Richmond fans. Let me know what you thought of the decision to draft another key forward in Thomas Sims. I'm curious. Let's get to the Saints. They were another really interesting one. Another team with a strong draft hand that didn't take players we expected. So, Toomey expected Travali and Toro, but I didn't think that they would go those 2 picks without taking a midfielder. In the end, Toomey was absolutely right. And on talent, those guys are good. And perhaps there's, a belief that Travalia plays midfield next year. I don't think that's necessarily the play, but it could be the justification. So when they re-entered the draft at 32 and took another key back, I thought that was curious. I know they've, replacing Josh Battle to some extent. But when this happened as well, we were looking at guys like Hoffman and Adrian Cole, who I think went undrafted now that I think about it. Perhaps they can add him as an NGA, like Cat B rookie. I'm not too sure. But at that time, we thought another key back. So 2 key backs plus Adrian Cole seems odd. In the end, they didn't take Adrian Cole. James Barrett is a good player, though, in my opinion. Now, he's 194 centimetres. I expect he will probably grow compared to Tom Barris's that aggressive intercepting style key back. And he's also played key forward. So I think he played key forward first and then went back and proved to be really good. So, perhaps there's the suggestion that maybe Taru or Barrett, or both, don't play key back, or at least for their entire careers. So as it played out, the balance of that is right. I know Travali is listed as a mid. I think he's a running defender, at least at first. I do think this selection here, 45 by St Kilda, was very prudent, and I think this might have stuffed up West Coast plans who had the next selection. So they traded in to get Hugh Boxall, 188 centimetre balanced midfielder. So they've added a midfielder there, which is good. I do like his talent. So, if he comes good, that really throws any criticism of this out. But I think generally speaking, with the opportunity there to draft, so maybe a Xavier Lindsay, perhaps, in hindsight with those first 2 selections, with Langford off the board and Smiley off the board with the previous 2 picks, maybe St Kilda would have gone those guys and then changed tack. Obviously prefer the talent of these 2 above Xavier Lindsay. Alex Dodson slid a big way. We thought the Saints might take a ruck. They'll be stoked to get him at 53 because I would have thought maybe 32 would have been the asking price for Alex Dodson, so they'll be happy with that. I don't know much about Patrick Sade. I'm going to say Sade. I don't think you say a surname as said. When it's a surname, you say it differently. Does that make sense? Anyway, congratulations to him for getting drafted. I don't know anything about him, but some real balance to that. I just thought they might have gone a bit more midfield heavy. Sydney had an interesting draft, as they so often do. Jesse Totoli, I thought, made sense. Bowman seems right on talents. Toomey had him at 30. He bolted a little bit. So they add 2 different style forwards, general forwards. Totoli's quite an impactful small forward who can play in the midfield and on a wing too. He showed that for Vic Metro too. Riley Bice is a mature age defender, medium-sized running defender. We thought general forwards and general defenders would make sense. I guess the surprise here for me is maybe a little bit twofold. I did think maybe this selection would be Jack Whitlock. Evidently, they didn't think a key forward was of a high enough priority for them to overlook the talent of Ned Bowman. What was interesting was that they let Collingwood have their academy player in Joel Cochran. I'm not too sure why, because they then drafted Riak Andrew from Melbourne's NGA, who I believe is from Melbourne's NGA, a 193 centimetre key defender. So an inch shorter as well, but it's interesting. I'm not too sure why. Was there some sort of points implication there where would Sydney have gone into a deficit next year had they matched? I'm not convinced by that. If they took 55 on Riak Andrew, they just preferred him as a talent. So that was a bit of a surprise that City let him go, but they do have a key defender out of this draft anyway. Then we've got the West Coast Eagles. Immediately after this, I'm going to film a West Coast focus one for my Eagles fan channel, True Eagle, if anyone wants to go check that out. But generally speaking, I think when you look at this from a value point of view, I don't think anyone expected Bo Allen to be there at 16. No one expected Jobe Shanahan to be there at 30. And Tom Gross, at least looking at the Fox Footy rankings, I think he was ranked in the top 33, I think it was. And generally speaking, considered a top 35 draftable talent. So the Eagles did need some midfielders. I'm not too sure if Bo is a midfielder at the next level, but Gross, pretty much is. Luca Grego might be the only player in my time watching West Coast that I've seen us draft and I didn't know who they were. I've never heard of this bloke. And that's just my own ignorance, but still, that's a first for me. However, it looks like a likely type, an aggressive running defender. Listed as a midfielder, he'll be a defender for sure. And then Hamish Davis, one of the biggest slides of the draft. I'm not amazingly shocked to see players like that slide. I think it was such an even talent pool that, if it was a perceived deficiency with Davis, it might have been foot skills. Perhaps that is why he slid so far. However, I do think one thing I like about this, not only the value of it, but 3 of these blokes played state level football this year. Bo, Hamish and Jobe played good quality games in the VFL and the Waffle this year. So hopefully that will enable them to come into the Eagles team, which desperately needs some help and help improve it. So some good balance. I thought a keyback might be on the agenda. But Jobe Shanahan might be one of the best picks in this draft, in my biased opinion. I think that is a great value selection. And finally, the Western Bulldogs, who more or less went to plan, at least in the way that I forecasted it. So I did a video on the Bulldogs before the draft, and I thought midfielders, general forwards, general defenders probably make sense. And if there's a good quality small forward, take him as well. So, Berry and Hannaford were off the board, and Cooper Hines makes perfect sense as the best available midfielder who's quite a contested inside player who can float forward and almost be like an undersized key forward. So I really like his talent, and I think the midfield was something the Bulldogs probably looked to add to, thinking about that under 21 group, someone to complement Riley Sanders. Lockie Jakes, a running defender. Again, I think other players I considered for them were Harry Oliver Angus Clark, but Harry Oliver was already gone. They preferred Lockie Jakes as that running defender from Geelong. They added the small forward in Josh Dolan. They added a mature player in Sam Davidson, a very highly performed VFL young talent. I think he won some award, forgive me, I forget, but there was no doubt he was going to get drafted today. I just wasn't sure where. So adding a ready-made talent for a team that is thinking also about the future, but has some degree of potential to compete deep in finals over the next few years as well, adding a mature age player does help, even if he's only 23. In fact, he's 22 with a late birthday there. Luke Kennedy, I'm not too aware of as a midfielder, but again, just another midfield talent to add to that young under 21 group. I'm relieved they didn't go tall with their second selection. They were a big threat to West Coast getting Shanahan. But I think that was probably the play here for the Bulldogs. They are very stocked, well stocked for talls. This draft was really about adding some running players, and I think they did a really good job with the selections they had. There you have it, guys. That is my take on every team in this year's draft. I mean, you can't conclude that anyone won the draft. I think Richmond are in a pretty good position to win the draft. I think St Kilda had some good selections. Some teams, like including West Coast, I thought had good value selections, players that were expected to go earlier, but we won't know answers on this for a long time. But let me know in the comments, guys, what did you think of your own team's selections, especially in the cold light of day? Have you been able to relax and get excited about these prospects? I'm still getting used to mine. I didn't know who Luca Grego was before this draft took place. But like I said, I will give my more extended thoughts on the Eagles channel that I run, True Eagle. So for now, thanks for watching. Thanks for being subscribed. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.